I was standing in the church fellowship hall, watching my sister Janet hold court at the microphone, when she smiled that particular smile, the one that meant someone was about to get publicly humiliated, and said, "Before we close tonight's family reunion planning meeting, I think we all need to address the elephant in the room." Her eyes found mine across the folding chairs and potluck tables. "Some people in this family need to learn that actions have consequences." I should have known right then that she'd found out about the Honda, but let me back up because you need to understand how we got here. My name is Sarah. I'm 42, and for most of my life, I've been the younger sister who couldn't do anything right. Not in Janet's eyes, anyway. Not in Mom's eyes either, before she passed 2 years ago, leaving behind a trust fund that Janet somehow convinced everyone she should manage for the family's sake. Janet is 3 years older, never married, works in corporate HR, and has turned passive aggression into an art form. She's the type of person who remembers every slat real or imagined and files them away like evidence in a case she's always building against you. Growing up, she was Mom's favorite, the responsible one, the one who got straight A's while I was struggling with dyslexia that nobody bothered to diagnose until I was in high school. The pattern was always the same. Janet would do something cruel or controlling. I'd react, and then suddenly I was the problem. I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too quick to take things personally. Mom would sigh and say, "Sarah, you know how your sister is. She means well." But Janet never meant well. Janet meant to win. After Mom died, things got worse. Mom left behind what she called the Family Emergency Fund, about $60,000 in a trust account that was supposed to help any of us kids if we hit hard times. The will named Janet as the trustee with instructions that she was to use her discretion in distributing funds as needed. I should have fought that designation in probate court, but I was dealing with my own grief, and my husband Tom was going through chemo at the time. I let it slide. Big mistake. The first time I asked Janet for help from the fund was when Tom's cancer treatment left us with medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. We needed $8,000 to keep from losing our house. Janet made me fill out a formal application. She actually created a form complete with a space for references and then scheduled a review meeting at her immaculate townhouse where she grilled me about our budget like I was applying for a mortgage. "I see you have a Netflix subscription," she said, scrolling through the bank statements I'd been required to provide. "And you're still paying for Tom's gym membership, even though he obviously can't use it right now." "The gym membership is frozen," I said. "We're not actually being charged." "Then why does it show up here?" She pointed to a line item with her perfectly manicured nail. I leaned closer to look. "That's a $10 maintenance fee. They charge it once a year to keep frozen accounts active. $10 is $10, Sarah. This is exactly the kind of financial irresponsibility that got you into this situation in the first place." She approved the loan. She called it a loan, even though Mom's will clearly stated the money was for family emergencies. But she made me sign a promissory note with a payment schedule, and she insisted on monthly check-ins to review our progress toward repayment. That was 3 years ago. Tom is in remission now, thank God, and we've been steadily paying Janet back at $200 a month, just like she demanded. But the monthly check-ins continued, and somehow they evolved into Janet treating me like a child who couldn't manage her own finances. She'd show up at our house, unannounced, to see how we were doing, which really meant she wanted to inspect our purchases and offer unsolicited advice about our spending. She'd open our refrigerator and comment on how we were buying name brand groceries instead of generic. She'd notice if we'd bought anything new, a throw pillow, a lamp, a book, and ask pointed questions about whether we really needed to spend money on such things when we still owed her money. "I'm just looking out for the family's interests," she'd say whenever I tried to push back. This is what Mom would have wanted, but the real control came through her position as trustee. Anytime someone in the family needed help, they had to go through Janet, and she used that power like a weapon. When our cousin Mike lost his job, Janet made him attend Dave Ramsey classes before she'd approve emergency funds. When our aunt needed help with her mortgage after Uncle Pete's heart attack, Janet required weekly budget reviews and insisted on paying the mortgage company directly instead of giving Aunt Linda the money. She kept meticulous records, I'll give her that. She had spreadsheets tracking every dollar that went out of the trust, every payment that came back, and every interaction with family members who needed help. She'd email quarterly reports to all the relatives written in the kind of corporate speak that made it sound like she was running a Fortune 500 company instead of managing what amounted to a family savings account. The worst part was that she was technically following the letter of Mom's will. Mom had given her discretion over distributions, and Janet interpreted that as broadly as possible. She set up criteria that Mom never specified, created procedures Mom never asked for, and turned every family emergency into an opportunity to demonstrate her authority. But Janet's control extended beyond the trust fund. She also took charge of organizing family events, managing Mom's estate, and basically positioning herself as the matriarch of our family. She decided when we'd have holiday gatherings, where we'd meet, who would bring what, and how long the events would last. She created group chats where she'd send detailed instructions and expect prompt responses. She'd book venues without asking anyone's input, then send invoices for everyone's share of the costs. Last Christmas, she decided we should rent a cabin in the Ozarks for a family reunion. She picked the dates right during my son's basketball tournament, booked the place without consulting anyone, and then informed us all via group text that we each owed her $300 for our share of the rental. When I mentioned that the dates didn't work for us because of the tournament, she replied, "The reservations are already made. I guess you'll have to decide what's more important." I chose my son's tournament, and Janet made sure everyone knew about it. She posted photos from the cabin on Facebook with captions like, "So sad not everyone could prioritize family time," and made pointed comments at subsequent gatherings about people who can't be counted on when it matters. This pattern of behavior, the financial control, the public shaming, the constant positioning of herself as the responsible adult dealing with irresponsible siblings, had been going on for years. But the incident that finally pushed me over the edge happened 3 weeks ago. I was having lunch with my friend Karen, who happens to be a CPA, and she asked how things were going with the trust fund situation. I ended up venting about Janet's control and the hoops she made everyone jump through to access what was supposed to be emergency money. You know, Karen said, stirring her salad thoughtfully, your mom's will is public record. Have you ever actually read the trust documents? Not just the summary Janet provided, but the actual legal language. I hadn't. I'd relied on Janet's interpretation of Mom's wishes, just like everyone else in the family. You might want to take a look, Karen suggested. Trust language is usually pretty specific about how much discretion a trustee actually has. And most family trusts have provisions about what happens if beneficiaries disagree with the trustee's decisions. That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse and requested copies of Mom's probate files. The clerk, a friendly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who remembered me from high school, helped me navigate the filing system and made copies of everything for a small fee. What I found when I got home and spread the documents across my kitchen table made my stomach churn. The trust language was clear. The fund was intended to provide assistance to family members facing genuine financial emergencies, with distributions to be made promptly and without unnecessary burden upon the beneficiaries. There was a specific clause stating that the trustee shall not impose requirements or conditions beyond what is necessary to verify the legitimacy of the emergency. Janet's application process, her budget reviews, her payment schedules, her monthly check-ins. None of that was authorized by the trust language. In fact, there was a provision that explicitly stated beneficiaries should not be required to repay emergency distributions unless they received money under false pretenses. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found in the quarterly reports Janet had been filing with the court. According to her official reports, the trust had distributed $47,000 over the past 2 years. But according to my own records and conversations with other family members, I could only account for about $32,000 in actual distributions. $15,000 was unaccounted for. I spent the next week quietly reaching out to relatives, asking carefully worded questions about their interactions with the trust fund. What I learned made me sick. Cousin Mike had never been required to take Dave Ramsey classes. According to him, Janet had simply delayed his distribution for 2 months, claiming the trust was under review by the attorneys, and that classes were recommended for anyone receiving assistance. He'd taken the classes on his own initiative, thinking it might speed up the process. Aunt Linda had never received the mortgage help she'd requested. Janet had told her the trust couldn't cover mortgage payments directly, only smaller emergency expenses. Linda had ended up refinancing her house at a much higher interest rate to avoid foreclosure. Our younger brother Daniel, who lives in Colorado, had been told the trust was temporarily unavailable for out of state distributions when he'd needed help with car repairs last summer. He'd ended up putting the repairs on a credit card and was still paying interest on the balance. In every case, Janet had documented the requests in her quarterly reports as distributions pending additional documentation or distributions declined due to insufficient emergency status. But she'd been reporting the requested amounts as if they'd actually been distributed. I stared at those reports spread across my kitchen table, adding up the numbers again and again, hoping I was wrong. But the math was clear. Janet had been systematically denying legitimate requests for help while reporting to the court that she'd approved them. She was skimming money from a trust fund intended to help her own family members during emergencies. I called Karen and asked her to meet me for coffee. I brought copies of everything: the trust documents, the quarterly reports, my own records of family members' requests, and Janet's responses. Karen's expression grew darker as she reviewed the paperwork. Finally, she sat back and whistled softly. Sarah, this is fraud. This is literal embezzlement of trust funds. Do you understand what you're looking at here? I think so, I said, though my voice was shaky. She's been stealing from the family. Not just stealing, she's been filing false reports with the court, which is perjury, and she's been using her position as trustee to defraud beneficiaries. This is felony territory. Karen helped me organize everything into a coherent timeline. We created a spreadsheet showing the discrepancies between Janet's reports and the actual distributions. We documented each family member's experience with requesting help and Janet's responses. We gathered bank statements, copies of the trust documents, and Janet's own quarterly reports. You need to file a complaint with the probate court, Karen said. The judge will order an audit of the trust accounts, and if there's evidence of misconduct, Janet will be removed as trustee immediately. The court might also refer the case to the district attorney for criminal charges. I knew she was right, but I also knew that filing a formal complaint would tear our family apart. Janet would deny everything, claim I was making false accusations because I was bitter about being denied money. Other family members who didn't know the full extent of what was happening would likely side with her. She was, after all, the responsible one, the one who'd been managing everyone's finances and organizing family events for years. I decided to try a different approach first. I would confront Janet directly, give her a chance to make things right voluntarily before involving the courts. I would document everything. Of course, I'd learned my lesson about the importance of evidence, but I would try to handle this within the family if possible. I called Janet and asked if we could meet for lunch. She suggested her favorite restaurant, an upscale place downtown where she liked to hold court and where she could control the environment. I agreed, even though I knew she was choosing the venue strategically. I arrived early and chose a corner table where we could speak privately. I brought a manila folder with copies of everything I'd discovered, but I kept it in my purse, hoping I wouldn't need to use it. Janet arrived exactly on time, dressed in one of her tailored business suits, looking like she was coming from a board meeting rather than lunch with her sister. She ordered a salad and mineral water, then sat back and gave me the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So, what's this about?" she asked. "You sounded strange on the phone." "I wanted to talk about Mom's trust fund," I said. "I've been looking into the distributions, and I think there might be some discrepancies we need to address." Her expression didn't change, but I saw her fingers tighten around her water glass. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Well, according to your quarterly reports, the trust has distributed more money than I can account for based on what family members have actually received. I'm wondering if maybe there's been some kind of administrative error, or maybe some distributions that got processed but didn't reach the intended recipients." Janet leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, I hope you're not questioning my management of the trust. I've been keeping meticulous records, following all the legal requirements, and acting in the family's best interests. Just because you don't understand the complexity of trust administration doesn't mean there's something wrong. I'm not questioning your management. I said, though, of course I was. I'm just trying to understand where some of the money went. For instance, you reported distributing $8,000 to help Daniel with medical expenses last winter, but he tells me he never received any money from the trust. Daniel's request was declined because he couldn't provide adequate documentation of the medical emergency. I explained this to him at the time. But you reported the money as distributed. No, I reported the request as processed. There's a difference. I reached into my purse and pulled out copies of the quarterly reports. Here's your filing from last winter. Line Item 17. Distribution to D. Morrison for medical emergency, $8,000 approved and processed. That doesn't sound like a declined request to me. Janet glanced at the document, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Not guilt exactly, but recognition that she'd been caught in an inconsistency. These reports use standardized language required by the court, she said. The terminology might be confusing to someone who doesn't work in finance, but I can assure you that every entry is accurate and properly categorized. What about Aunt Linda's mortgage payment? You reported distributing $12,000 for emergency housing assistance, but she never got the money. She had to refinance her house instead. Linda's situation was more complex than a simple emergency distribution. The trust language doesn't allow for direct mortgage payments, so I worked with her to explore alternative solutions. The money was held in escrow pending resolution of the housing situation, but ultimately she chose to pursue refinancing instead. So where's the $12,000 now? It was returned to the general trust fund when Linda declined the assistance. But it's not listed as a return distribution in any of your subsequent reports. Janet's jaw tightened. Sarah, I don't appreciate being interrogated about my handling of family finances. I've been managing this trust according to legal requirements and Mom's wishes, and I've been doing it without compensation while dealing with constant requests for money from family members who seem to think the trust is their personal ATM. If you have specific concerns, you're welcome to consult with the attorneys who helped draft the trust documents. I did consult with an attorney, I said quietly. Actually, I consulted with the probate court records, and I've reviewed the original trust language that Mom signed. This time, Janet went completely still. The restaurant noise, clinking glasses, conversations from other tables, the hiss of the espresso machine seemed to fade into the background. And what did you find? She asked. I found that you've been imposing requirements and conditions that aren't authorized by the trust. I found that you've been charging family members for emergency distributions when the trust language specifically prohibits repayment requirements. And I found discrepancies between what you've reported to the court and what you've actually distributed to family members. Janet set down her fork and leaned back in her chair. When she spoke, her voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. Let me explain something to you, Sarah. You've always been irresponsible with money. You've always been quick to blame other people for your problems. And you've always been jealous of anyone who has more discipline and success than you do. Mom knew this when she made me the trustee instead of you. She knew that you would run through that money in 6 months and come back asking for more. This isn't about me, I said. This is about $15,000 in missing funds and false reports filed with the court. Missing funds. Janet's voice rose slightly, causing a couple at the next table to glance in our direction. There are no missing funds. Every penny has been accounted for and properly documented. Just because you don't understand trust administration doesn't mean there's been any misconduct. Then you won't mind if I request an independent audit of the trust accounts. Janet stared at me for a long moment, then she reached for her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, which she placed on the table next to her barely touched salad. You do whatever you think you need to do, she said, standing up. But understand that once you start making accusations like this, there's no taking them back. You'll be destroying your relationship with everyone in this family, and for what? Because you're bitter that I wouldn't give you more money whenever you wanted it. She paused at the edge of the table, looking down at me with an expression I'd seen many times, growing up the look she got when she was about to deliver the killing blow. Mom was right about you, she said. You've never taken responsibility for anything in your life, and now you're going to blame me for your financial problems, just like you blamed your teachers for your bad grades and your coaches for not making the team. Then she walked away, leaving me sitting alone with the documents spread across the table and the attention of several curious diners who'd overheard the tail end of our conversation. I sat there for a few more minutes, my hands shaking as I gathered up the papers and put them back in the folder. The waitress came over and asked if everything was okay. I told her it was fine, paid for both meals, and drove home in a daze. Tom was working in the garage when I pulled into the driveway. He took one look at my face and asked what had happened. I told him everything about the trust documents, the missing money, the confrontation with Janet. He listened without interrupting, occasionally shaking his head or muttering under his breath. "So what do we do now?" he asked when I finished. "I guess I file the complaint with the court," I said. "Karen already gave me the forms." Tom nodded slowly. "You know this is going to get ugly, right? Janet's not going to go down without a fight." "I know. And some of the family is going to side with her, at least at first." "I know that too." Tom reached over and took my hand. "But you're going to do it anyway." "I have to. She's stealing from people who trust her, from our own family members who needed help and got turned away while she was pocketing their money. Then we'll figure it out together." That was 2 weeks ago. I spent the following week completing the formal complaint and gathering additional documentation. Karen helped me organize everything into a coherent case file, and we submitted it to the probate court along with a request for an emergency audit of the trust accounts. The court clerk called 3 days later to inform me that a hearing had been scheduled for the following month and that Janet would be served with notice of the complaint within the next few days. I was expecting Janet to call to email to show up at my house something, but she didn't. The silence was almost worse than her anger would have been. Then, last Tuesday morning, I walked out to my driveway to find my Honda Pilot sitting at an odd angle. When I tried to start it, the engine made a horrible grinding noise and died immediately. I called Tom, who came home from work to help me figure out what was wrong. We popped the hood and found nothing obviously broken. Tom checked the oil, the battery, the belts. Everything looked normal. "We're going to have to tow it to the shop," he said. "Whatever's wrong, it's internal." Murphy's Garage has been servicing our cars for years, and Mike Murphy knows our vehicles almost as well as we do. When I dropped off the Pilot and described the symptoms, he promised to take a look as soon as possible. He called me that afternoon with news that made my blood run cold. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this," he said. "Someone put soda in your gas tank. Coca-Cola from the looks of it. The sugar crystallized in your fuel system and seized up your engine." "Are you sure?" "I've been doing this for 25 years and I've never seen anything quite like it. But there's no question that's what happened. The fuel lines are clogged with caramelized sugar and your engine is basically destroyed." "How much is it going to cost to fix?" "Well, that's the thing. You're looking at a complete engine rebuild, probably $8,000 to $10,000. At that point, you might as well buy a different car." I sat down hard in my kitchen chair. Mike, who would do something like this? I don't know, but whoever it was knew what they were doing. This wasn't random vandalism. This was deliberate sabotage. I thanked Mike and hung up, my mind racing. There was only one person who would have reason to retaliate against me right now. Only one person who would know that destroying my car would cause maximum inconvenience and expense at a time when I was already dealing with legal costs and family drama. But proving it was a different matter entirely. I called the police and filed a report, but the officer who took my statement was skeptical that they'd be able to find the person responsible unless there were witnesses or surveillance footage. Our neighborhood doesn't have many security cameras, and the incident had probably happened in the middle of the night when no one was around to see anything. "Do you have any idea who might want to damage your vehicle?" Officer Martinez asked. I hesitated, knowing how it would sound. "I'm in the middle of a legal dispute with my sister over our mother's trust fund. She might be angry about that." "Angry enough to destroy your car?" "Maybe." Officer Martinez made a note in his report, but I could tell he thought I was grasping at straws. Without evidence, there was nothing the police could do. That evening, Tom and I were discussing our options. We needed a car immediately, but we couldn't afford to buy one, while also paying for the legal proceedings against Janet, when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Janet. I heard about your car trouble. That's terrible. I guess actions really do have consequences. I showed the message to Tom, whose face went dark with anger. That's practically a confession, he said. It's suggestive, but it's not proof. Take a screenshot, save everything. I did, but I also realized that Janet was smarter than I'd given her credit for. The message was phrased in a way that could be interpreted as sympathetic concern rather than an admission of guilt. She was letting me know she was responsible without giving me anything I could use against her in court. The next few days were a logistical nightmare. Tom had to drive me to work and pick me up every day. I had to reschedule client meetings and rely on friends for rides to the grocery store and other errands. The inconvenience was exactly what Janet had intended, a reminder that she could disrupt my life anytime she wanted. But Janet had made a mistake. In her eagerness to send me a gloating message about the car, she'd used her personal cell phone. And when I looked more closely at the timing of her text, I realized something interesting. The message had been sent at 10:47 p.m. on Tuesday night, just about 6 hours after I'd spoken to Mike Murphy about the diagnosis. There was no way Janet could have known about my car trouble unless she'd either caused it herself or had inside information about the repair shop's findings. I called Mike Murphy the next morning and asked if anyone had inquired about my car besides Tom and me. Funny you should ask, he said. A woman called yesterday afternoon asking about the status of your Honda, said she was your sister and was wondering if the repairs would be covered by insurance. What did you tell her? I told her I couldn't discuss customer information with anyone who wasn't on the authorized contact list. She got pretty snippy about it, said she was trying to help you figure out your options. Did she give you her name? Janet something, Morrison, I think. I thanked Mike and hung up, then immediately called Karen. She screwed up, I said, explaining about the phone call to the repair shop and the suspicious timing of Janet's text message. Maybe, Karen said, but you still don't have direct proof that she put the soda in your gas tank. What if I could get her to admit it? How I'd been thinking about this since the previous night. What if I recorded a conversation with her? If I could get her to confess, would that be admissible in court? In Missouri, you can record a conversation as long as one party consents, which would be you. But Sarah, be careful. If Janet realizes what you're doing, it could backfire spectacularly. That's when I started planning what I now think of as my nuclear option. The family reunion that Janet had mentioned at the church fellowship hall was scheduled for the following weekend. She'd been organizing it for months, renting the community center at the lake, coordinating potluck assignments, and generally treating it like a corporate event she was managing. She'd been sending group texts with updates and reminders, and she'd made it clear that she expected everyone to attend. This is our chance to come together as a family and focus on what really matters, one of her messages had read. After all the stress and drama of recent months, we need to remember that we're stronger when we're united. The irony was almost too much to bear, but the reunion would also be the perfect opportunity to confront Janet publicly with the entire family present as witnesses. I could present my evidence about the trust fund fraud in front of everyone, and if I played my cards right, I might be able to get Janet to admit to sabotaging my car as well. I spent the rest of the week preparing. I made copies of all the trust documents, the quarterly reports, the bank statements, and the communications with family members about their experiences with requesting assistance. I organized everything into a presentation that would be easy for non-lawyers to understand. I also consulted with an attorney, not Karen, but a specialist in trust and estate litigation that Karen recommended. His name was David Chen, and he'd been practicing probate law for 15 years. You have a strong case for breach of fiduciary duty and possible fraud, he said after reviewing my documentation. But before we proceed with formal legal action, it might be worth giving your sister one last chance to resolve this voluntarily. If she agrees to make restitution and step down as trustee, that would be better for everyone involved. And if she doesn't agree, then we file criminal charges along with the civil complaint. With this level of documentation, the district attorney would almost certainly prosecute. David helped me draft what he called a final demand letter, essentially an ultimatum that gave Janet 30 days to return the missing funds, resign as trustee, and provide a full accounting of all trust transactions. If she didn't comply, we would proceed with both criminal and civil action. The key, David explained, is to make the consequences of noncompliance clear and severe enough that she'd rather settle than fight. But you also have to be prepared to follow through if she calls your bluff. I left David's office with the demand letter in my briefcase and a recording app loaded on my phone. The reunion was in 3 days, and I was as ready as I'd ever be. Tom was worried about the whole plan. What if she denies everything? What if she turns the family against you? Then at least I'll know I tried to handle it the right way, I said, and I'll have witnesses to whatever she says in response. The morning of the reunion, I woke up with butterflies in my stomach that felt more like bats. Tom made coffee while I reviewed my notes one last time, trying to anticipate every possible response Janet might have. You don't have to do this," Tom said, sitting down beside me at the kitchen table. "Yes, I do. If I don't stop her now, she'll keep stealing from the family, and she'll keep finding ways to punish anyone who challenges her authority." The car was just the beginning. Tom nodded slowly. "Okay, but I'm going to be right there with you." We drove to the lake in our borrowed car, my mother-in-law's old Camry that she'd let us use until we could replace the Honda. The community center was a rustic building with knotty pine walls and a view of the water through tall windows. Janet had decorated the tables with wildflowers and printed programs that included a timeline of family history and a list of planned activities. She was in her element directing people to their assigned seats, making sure the potluck dishes were arranged properly on the buffet table, and generally orchestrating the event like a wedding planner. She smiled and hugged everyone, played the role of the gracious hostess, and accepted compliments about her organizational skills with practiced modesty. "Sarah," she called out when she spotted me near the entrance, "I'm so glad you made it. I wasn't sure if you'd be able to manage transportation." The comment was delivered with a sweet smile, but everyone within earshot understood the reference to my car troubles. A few relatives glanced at me with expressions of sympathy or curiosity. "We figured it out," I said, matching her smile. "Tom's mother was kind enough to lend us her car until we can get our situation resolved." "Now, that's what family is for," Janet replied, "helping each other through difficult times." I wanted to ask her if that philosophy applied when she was pouring soda into people's gas tanks, but I held my tongue. This wasn't the time or place for that conversation. Not yet. The reunion followed Janet's carefully planned schedule. We started with a welcome speech from our oldest uncle, followed by a potluck lunch, then a slideshow of family photos that Janet had compiled. Everyone was relaxed and happy, catching up with relatives they hadn't seen in months, sharing stories and laughing at old jokes. I participated in all of it, but part of my mind was elsewhere, rehearsing what I was going to say when the time came. I decided to wait until after the formal program, when people were lingering over dessert and coffee, to bring up the trust fund issues. That would give me a captive audience without disrupting the actual reunion activities. Around 3 o'clock, Janet stood up and tapped her spoon against her water glass to get everyone's attention. "Before we start cleaning up," she said, "I want to take a moment to address something that's been weighing on my heart." My stomach dropped. She was going to try to control the narrative to present her version of events before I had a chance to speak. "As many of you know," she continued, "I've been serving as the trustee for Mom's emergency fund, trying to carry out her wishes to help family members who are facing difficult times. It's been a responsibility I've taken very seriously, and I've tried to be a good steward of the resources Mom left for all of us." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Janet had always been viewed as the responsible one, and most of the family appreciated her efforts to manage Mom's estate. Unfortunately, Janet said, her voice growing heavier, not everyone has been satisfied with my administration of the trust. Some people have made accusations about my handling of family funds, and there are even legal proceedings pending that could force expensive audits and investigations. I felt every eye in the room turned toward me. My face was burning, but I kept my expression neutral. "I want to address these concerns directly," Janet continued, "because I believe in transparency and accountability. I've brought copies of all the trust documents, the quarterly reports I've filed with the court, and detailed records of every distribution that's been made over the past 2 years." She gestured toward a card table near the windows where she'd arranged several binders and file folders. Anyone who has questions about the trust management is welcome to review these records. I have nothing to hide, and I'm confident that any independent audit will confirm that every penny has been properly accounted for and distributed according to Mom's wishes. The room was completely silent. Janet looked directly at me with an expression of sad disappointment, as if I was a troubled child who'd forced her to have an uncomfortable family meeting. I hope that once people have had a chance to review the actual documentation, instead of relying on secondhand information or misunderstandings, we can put this unfortunate situation behind us and focus on supporting each other as a family. She sat down to a smattering of applause, and immediately several relatives began moving toward the card table to examine the binders she'd brought. I realized I was trapped. Janet had outmaneuvered me by presenting her evidence first and framing the dispute as a misunderstanding rather than fraud. If I stood up now and made accusations based on the documentation in my purse, it would look like I was being vindictive and disruptive. But then I remembered something David Chen had told me. The truth has a way of revealing itself when people are put under pressure. Don't be afraid to ask direct questions and let the inconsistencies speak for themselves. I stood up, my heart pounding, and addressed the room. I appreciate Janet's willingness to share the trust documents, I said, and I agree that transparency is important, but I think there are some specific questions that need to be answered before we can resolve this situation. Janet's eyes narrowed, but she maintained her patient expression. For instance, I continued, Janet's quarterly report from last winter shows a distribution of $8,000 to Daniel for medical expenses. Daniel, did you receive that money? All eyes turned to my younger brother, who was sitting near the back of the room with his wife and kids. He looked uncomfortable being put on the spot, but he answered honestly, No, I never got any money from the trust. Janet told me that my request was denied because I couldn't provide enough documentation. Murmurs began rippling through the room. Janet stood up quickly. Daniel's situation was more complex than a simple emergency distribution, she said. The trust language requires verification of legitimate emergencies, and unfortunately, Daniel wasn't able to provide the medical records and bills necessary to confirm his need. But you reported the money as distributed. I said, if the request was denied, why didn't your report reflect that? The reports use standardized language required by the court. The terminology might be confusing to someone who doesn't understand legal documents, but every entry is accurate. I reached into my purse and pulled out my copies of the quarterly reports. According to your file, in the entry reads, Distribution to D. Morrison for medical emergency, $8,000 approved and processed. That doesn't sound like denied request language to me. I handed the document to my Uncle Jerry, who was sitting closest to me. He put on his reading glasses and examined the page. It sure looks like it says the money was approved and distributed, he said slowly. There are different categories of processing. Janet said, her voice growing tighter. The money was allocated for Daniel's request, pending receipt of adequate documentation. When the documentation wasn't provided, the allocation was returned to the general fund. Show me where that return transaction is recorded in your subsequent reports, I said. Janet stared at me for a moment, then moved toward the card table where her binders were arranged. It's in the detailed transaction log, she said, flipping through pages. Here in the March filing. She pointed to a line item, but when Uncle Jerry examined it, he shook his head. This shows a reconciliation adjustment of $8,000, but it doesn't specifically reference Daniel's request or explain what was being reconciled. I could see that I was gaining ground, but I needed to be careful not to seem like I was attacking Janet personally rather than seeking clarification about the trust administration. What about Aunt Linda's mortgage assistance? I asked. Your report shows $12,000 distributed for emergency housing expenses, but Linda never received that money. Aunt Linda, who was sitting at a table near the window, spoke up without being prompted. I asked Janet for help when Pete had his heart attack and we couldn't make our mortgage payments. She told me the trust couldn't cover mortgage payments directly, and she suggested I refinance instead. I never got any money from the trust. Linda's situation required a different approach, Janet said quickly. Direct mortgage payments would have created tax complications and liability issues for the trust. I worked with her to explore alternatives that would be more beneficial in the long run. but you reported the money as distributed for emergency housing assistance, I said. If you didn't actually give Linda the money, where did it go? Janet's face was flushed now, and she was shuffling through her binders with increasing agitation. The money was held in a separate account pending resolution of Linda's housing situation. When she chose to pursue refinancing, instead the funds were returned to the general trust fund. Show me the separate account records, I said. I don't have those documents with me today. Show me where the returned funds are recorded in your quarterly reports. Janet was quiet for a long moment, flipping through pages. Finally, she looked up with an expression of frustrated anger. Sarah, I don't appreciate being interrogated like this in front of our entire family. I've been managing this trust according to legal requirements and Mom's wishes, and I've been doing it without compensation while dealing with constant requests for money from people who seem to think the trust is their personal bank account. I'm not questioning your motives, I said. I'm asking for clarification about specific discrepancies between what you've reported to the court and what family members have actually received. There are no discrepancies. There are complex situations that required careful handling, and there are people who don't understand the legal constraints that govern trust administration. I reached into my purse and pulled out the summary Karen had helped me prepare, a simple spreadsheet showing Janet's reported distributions next to the actual amounts received by family members. According to your quarterly reports, I said, the trust has distributed $47,000 over the past 2 years. But based on conversations with family members, I can only account for $32,000 in actual distributions. That leaves $15,000 unaccounted for. I handed copies of the spreadsheet to several relatives who began examining the numbers and murmuring among themselves. Janet's composure was finally cracking. These calculations are based on misunderstandings and incomplete information. People don't always remember the details of financial transactions, and they don't always understand the different ways assistance can be provided. Then help us understand, I said. Walk us through each discrepancy and explain where the money went. Janet stared at me with undisguised hostility. The room was completely silent except for the rustle of paper as people examined my documentation. Finally, Janet spoke, and her voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. I think what's really happening here is that you're bitter about being denied additional assistance from the trust, and you're trying to undermine my authority as trustee by making false accusations and creating confusions about complex financial transactions. This isn't about me being denied money, I said. This is about $15,000 that can't be accounted for. There is no missing money, Janet snapped. Every penny has been properly documented and accounted for. Just because you don't understand trust administration doesn't mean there's been any misconduct. Then you won't mind if I request an independent audit of the trust accounts. Janet went completely still. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant laughter of children playing outside by the lake. Then Janet's expression shifted into something I'd never seen before, pure, undiluted rage. You want to know what I think, she said, her voice rising. I think you've been planning this for weeks. I think you deliberately staged this confrontation to humiliate me in front of our entire family because you're jealous that Mom trusted me with this responsibility instead of you. Janet, no, let me finish. You've always been irresponsible with money. You've always been quick to blame other people for your problems. And you've always resented anyone who had more success or stability than you do. The room was completely silent now. Even the children outside had stopped playing. Mom knew this when she made me the trustee, Janet continued. She knew that you would run through that money in 6 months and come back asking for more. She knew that you couldn't be trusted with the responsibility of managing family resources. I felt my face burning, but I kept my voice steady. This isn't about Mom's opinion of my financial responsibility. This is about specific discrepancies in your reports and missing funds. Missing funds. Janet's voice was sharp with sarcasm. You want to talk about missing funds? Let's talk about your car. My heart stopped. The room was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. What about my car? I asked. Janet smiled, and it was the cruelest expression I'd ever seen on her face. I heard you had some trouble with your Honda. Engine problems, wasn't it? That's expensive. How did you know about my engine problems? Word gets around. It's a small town. I reached into my pocket and activated the recording app on my phone. What kind of word gets around? Oh, people talk, especially when someone has to have their car towed to Murphy's garage because they can't get it started. And what do people say about why I couldn't get my car started? Janet's smile widened. They say someone put soda in your gas tank. Coca-Cola, from what I heard. Amazing what sugar can do to an engine, isn't it? The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Several people started talking at once, but I held up my hand for silence. How did you know it was Coca-Cola specifically? I asked. For just a moment, Janet's expression flickered with uncertainty. Then she recovered. That's what I heard. Like I said, word gets around. From who the only people who knew the specific brand of soda were me, my husband, and the mechanic. Janet's face was flushed now, and I could see her trying to calculate how much she'd revealed. I don't remember exactly who told me. Maybe it was someone at the grocery store or the post office. You know how people talk in small towns. I looked around the room at the faces of my relatives, some shocked, some confused, some beginning to understand what they were witnessing. Janet, I said quietly, did you put soda in my gas tank? Of course not. Why would I do something like that? Because you were angry about the trust fund complaint I filed with the probate court. I don't know what you're talking about. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, which was displaying Janet's text message from the night after my car was sabotaged. Then how do you explain this text you sent me? I said, reading aloud. I heard about your car trouble. That's terrible. I guess actions really do have consequences. Janet stared at the phone screen, and I could see her trying to figure out how to explain the message. That was just, I was trying to be sympathetic about your situation. By suggesting that my car problems were consequences for my actions, I meant that sometimes bad things happen when people make poor decisions. What poor decisions did I make that would result in someone vandalizing my car? Janet was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was defensive and angry. You filed a frivolous lawsuit against me based on false accusations. You're trying to destroy my reputation and undermine my authority as trustee. Maybe someone in the community didn't appreciate that kind of behavior. Are you saying someone vandalized my car because they were upset about my legal complaint? I'm saying that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are unpleasant. I looked around the room again. My relatives were staring at Janet with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Uncle Jerry was shaking his head slowly, and Aunt Linda had her hand pressed to her mouth. Janet, I said, I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you put soda in my gas tank? Janet stared at me with pure hatred in her eyes. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Prove it. That is when I knew I had her, not because she'd confessed she was too smart for that, but because her response revealed that she wasn't denying it anymore. She was challenging me to provide evidence, which meant she knew there was something to provide evidence of. I reached into my purse and pulled out the legal documents David Chin had prepared. I don't have to prove it right now, I said, but the police are investigating the vandalism and they have my phone record showing your text message about consequences. They also have the repair shop's records showing that you called asking about insurance coverage for my car repairs information you couldn't have had unless you knew what kind of damage had been done. Janet's face went white. I never called any repair shop. Mike Murphy has records of a woman who identified herself as Janet Morrison calling to ask about the status of my Honda. The call came the same day he diagnosed the problem, and your text message was sent just 6 hours later. Janet opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I continued, the police are also investigating the trust fund discrepancies, and the probate court has ordered an independent audit of all trust accounts. If there's evidence of fraud or embezzlement, the case will be referred to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. I handed Janet the formal demand letter David Chen had drafted. This gives you 30 days to return the missing funds, resign as trustee, and provide a full accounting of all trust transactions. If you don't comply, we'll proceed with both criminal and civil action. Janet took the letter with shaking hands, but didn't open it. There's one more thing, I said. Earlier you asked me to prove that you vandalized my car. Well, I can't prove it yet, but I have something almost as good. I held up my phone, which was still running the recording app. I have a recording of this entire conversation, including your detailed knowledge of the specific brand of soda that was used to destroy my engine, your admission that you knew about consequences for my actions, and your challenge for me to prove your involvement instead of simply denying it. Janet stared at the phone in horror. You recorded me without my permission. In Missouri, I only need one party's consent to record a conversation. Since I'm one of the parties, the recording is completely legal and admissible in court. The room was dead silent. Janet looked around at the faces of our relatives, all of whom were staring at her with expressions of shock and disappointment. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was barely audible. You don't understand what you've done. You've destroyed this family. No, I said quietly. I've exposed what was already destroying it. Janet stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair. She grabbed her purse and the binders she'd brought, her movements sharp and jerky. Don't expect me to ever forgive you for this, she said, her voice thick with tears and rage. Don't expect me to ever speak to you again, and don't expect the family to choose your side just because you've made a bunch of accusations and recorded private conversations. She looked around the room one last time, her gaze stopping on each relative's face. I've spent 2 years managing Mom's trust without taking a penny in compensation, trying to honor her wishes and help all of you during difficult times. And this is the thanks I get: false accusations, legal threats, and public humiliation. She started toward the door, then stopped and turned back to face me. But you know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe I should resign as trustee. Maybe I should let the court appoint some stranger to manage the family funds, someone who doesn't know or care about any of us. Maybe then you'll appreciate what I've been trying to do. She walked out, slamming the door behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. Then Uncle Jerry cleared his throat. Well, he said slowly, I think we need to have a family meeting about what happens next. What happened next was 3 hours of difficult conversation as we worked through the implications of what we'd all witnessed. Some relatives were shocked by the evidence of financial discrepancies and wanted immediate action. Others were reluctant to believe that Janet had been deliberately stealing from the family and wanted to give her a chance to explain. But everyone agreed that the trust needed independent oversight, and everyone was disturbed by Janet's apparent knowledge of my car vandalism. By the end of the evening, we had reached consensus on several key points. First, the family would support my request for an independent audit of the trust accounts. Second, we would ask the probate court to appoint a new trustee regardless of the audit findings. Third, if the audit revealed evidence of fraud or embezzlement, we would cooperate fully with any criminal investigation. Fourth, we would establish new procedures for trust distributions that emphasize transparency and accountability. And finally, we would try to handle the situation with as much dignity as possible, recognizing that Janet was still family despite her apparent misconduct. The drive home was quiet. Tom held my hand while I stared out the window at the dark countryside, trying to process everything that had happened. How do you feel? He asked finally. Exhausted, I said, and sad, and relieved, and angry all at the same time. Do you regret confronting her like that? I thought about it for a moment. No. If I'd tried to handle this privately, she would have kept denying everything and probably would have found ways to retaliate. At least now the whole family knows what's been going on, and there are witnesses to what she said about the car. What do you think happens next? The audit will take a few weeks, but I'm pretty sure it's going to confirm that she's been stealing money. The car vandalism is going to be harder to prove, but the recording might be enough to support criminal charges. Tom squeezed my hand. And the family, I don't know. Some of them will forgive her eventually, and some of them will side with her no matter what the evidence shows. But at least now everyone knows the truth. 3 weeks later, the independent auditor hired by the probate court released his findings. Janet had embezzled $18,000 from the trust fund over a 2-year period using a complex scheme involving phantom distributions and falsified reports. The auditor found that she had created fake documentation for several family members' requests, reported the money as distributed, then transferred the funds to a personal account she had opened specifically for this purpose. She had used the stolen money to pay for her townhouse renovations, her new car, and her vacation to Europe last summer, expenses she had carefully concealed from family members by maintaining her modest lifestyle in public while privately upgrading her standard of living. The day after the audit results were released, Janet was arrested at her workplace on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and filing false reports with the court. The arrest made the local newspaper, which described it as a family trust fund scandal and included details about the missing money and the confrontation at the family reunion. The car vandalism charges took longer to develop. The police had interviewed Mike Murphy about Janet's phone call to the repair shop, and they had analyzed the timing of her text message and the recording I'd made at the reunion. While they couldn't definitively prove that Janet had physically poured soda into my gas tank, they had enough circumstantial evidence to charge her with criminal mischief and harassment. The combination of her detailed knowledge of the specific brand of soda, her threatening text message, her phone call to the repair shop, and her recorded statements about consequences was sufficient to convince a grand jury to indict her. Janet hired an expensive attorney who attempted to negotiate a plea deal that would allow her to avoid jail time in exchange for making full restitution and pleading guilty to reduced charges. But the district attorney's office was unwilling to make concessions, particularly given the breach of fiduciary duty involved in the trust fund embezzlement. The case went to trial 8 months later. I testified about the trust fund discrepancies, the car vandalism, and the confrontation at the family reunion. The prosecution played the recording I'd made, which was admitted as evidence despite Janet's attorney's objections. Several family members also testified about their experiences with requesting assistance from the trust and being denied help, while Janet reported the money as distributed. The most damaging testimony came from a forensic accountant who had traced the stolen money through multiple bank accounts and clearly demonstrated how Janet had used fraudulent documentation to cover her tracks. Janet's defense strategy was to claim that she had been overwhelmed by the responsibilities of trust management and had made accounting errors rather than deliberately stealing money. Her attorney argued that the car vandalism charges were based on speculation and circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof of wrongdoing. But the jury wasn't convinced. After 2 days of deliberation, they found Janet guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, filing false reports, criminal mischief, and harassment. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months contingent on making full restitution to the trust fund. She was also ordered to pay court costs and attorney fees, and she was permanently barred from serving as a fiduciary for any trust or estate. The family trust was dissolved by court order, with the remaining funds distributed equally among Mom's children and grandchildren. The court appointed a professional trustee to oversee the distribution process and ensure that all beneficiaries received their fair share. I used my portion of the inheritance to replace my Honda and to pay the legal fees I had incurred during the investigation and prosecution. The rest went into a college fund for my son and a retirement account for Tom and me. But the financial resolution was easier than the emotional aftermath. The family was permanently fractured by the scandal. Some relatives believed Janet had been treated too harshly and blamed me for pursuing criminal charges instead of handling the matter privately. Others felt that justice had been served and that Janet's behavior had been unforgivable. Janet's closest allies in the family, particularly our Aunt Susan, who had always favored Janet, cut off contact with me entirely. They claimed that I had orchestrated a vindictive prosecution of a family member who had been trying to help everyone and had simply made some accounting mistakes. But most of the family supported my decision to expose Janet's fraud, especially after they learned the full extent of her deception and the systematic ways she had denied help to family members while stealing their money. The hardest part was dealing with my own complicated feelings about what had happened. Janet was still my sister despite everything, and seeing her in prison clothes during the trial was devastating. Part of me felt guilty for pursuing criminal charges even though I knew she had left me no choice. Tom reminded me regularly that I had done the right thing, not just for myself, but for all the family members who had been denied help, while Janet was enriching herself with their money. She made the choice to steal from her own family, he said. You just made the choice to hold her accountable. The recording I'd made at the family reunion became something of a local legend. Word spread about how I'd confronted my sister with evidence of her fraud and gotten her to essentially confess on tape. People I barely knew would approach me at the grocery store or the post office to tell me they'd heard about what happened and to express their admiration for how I'd handled the situation. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who'd been forced to make impossible choices in an impossible situation and who had tried to choose the option that protected the most people from further harm. A year after Janet's conviction, I received a letter from her in prison. It was short and formal, written in the precise handwriting I'd known since childhood. Sarah, I want you to know that I understand why you felt you had to expose what I was doing with the trust fund. I also want you to know that I'm getting counseling here and trying to understand why I made the choices I made. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't expect our relationship to ever be the same, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry for the pain I caused you and the rest of the family, Janet. I read the letter several times looking for some hint of the sister I'd once known, some trace of genuine remorse or personal responsibility. But even in her apology, Janet was careful to avoid admitting specific wrongdoing or acknowledging the full scope of what she'd done. I never wrote back, not because I was unwilling to forgive, but because I knew that any response would be seen as an opening for Janet to try to manipulate the situation or rebuild a relationship on her terms rather than honest terms. Instead, I focused on the new family dynamics that had emerged from the wreckage of the scandal. Without Janet's controlling presence, family gatherings became more relaxed and genuine. Decision-making became more collaborative. People felt free to speak their minds without worrying about Janet's judgment or retaliation. The younger generation, my son and his cousins, learned about the importance of financial transparency and accountability. They saw firsthand how power corrupts when there are no checks and balances, and how family relationships can be weaponized by people who prioritize control over love. Most importantly, I learned that standing up to a bully, even a family member, requires courage, but it also requires careful preparation and a willingness to accept the consequences of speaking the truth. The truth doesn't always set you free, but it does reveal who people really are underneath their public personas. And sometimes that revelation is worth the cost of everything that comes after. 3 years later, Janet was released on parole after serving the minimum sentence and making full restitution to the trust fund. She moved to another state and cut off contact with the entire family, apparently deciding that a fresh start somewhere else was preferable to trying to rebuild relationships with people who knew what she'd done. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was working as a bookkeeper for a small business and living in a modest apartment. She had apparently learned to manage her finances more responsibly, possibly because she no longer had access to other people's money to supplement her income. I felt a complex mixture of sadness and relief when I learned she had left town. Sad because it meant our relationship was truly over, relief because it meant I didn't have to worry about running into her at the grocery store or having awkward encounters at community events. The family has slowly healed from the trauma of the scandal. We've learned to talk more openly about money and to be more careful about how we handle shared financial responsibilities. We've also learned to pay attention to warning signs of manipulation and control, and to speak up when someone's behavior seems problematic. Most importantly, we've learned that family loyalty doesn't mean protecting family members from the consequences of their harmful actions. Real loyalty means holding each other accountable to shared values of honesty, integrity, and mutual respect. I still drive past the community center at the lake sometimes, and I remember that August afternoon when everything changed. I remember the feeling of standing up in front of the entire family and speaking the truth, even though I knew it would tear us apart. I remember the sound of Janet's voice when she challenged me to prove what she had done, not realizing that I already had all the proof I needed. And I remember the moment when I realized that some battles are worth fighting, even when the cost is higher than you ever imagined it could be. The truth about family is that blood doesn't make people trustworthy, and DNA doesn't guarantee that someone will act in your best interests. The people who deserve your loyalty are the ones who earn it through consistent actions over time, not the ones who demand it based on shared genetics. Janet taught me that lesson in the most painful way possible, but she also taught me that I'm stronger than I thought I was, and that sometimes the right choice is also the hardest choice. And that knowledge, difficult as it was to acquire, has been worth every uncomfortable moment of the journey to get it.